doctoral history at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Apart from journal articles, the title of his manuscript is Crossroads, Slaving Frontiers of Angola, 1780, 1877, 1867. I just added one more decade for you. Over there, we have Daryle Williams. He's Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. He's the author of the award-winning book, Cultural Wars in Brazil, the First Vargas Regime. And he also has a book-length project on this topic entitled Broken Path of Freedom, a special history of free Africans in 19th century Brazilian slave society. Daryle is also a fellow of the Stanford University Spatial History Lab. Okay, well, I leave you with them.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming to my presentation. I'm going to talk about the Kimbundu origins of the Africans transported in the slave ship Brilhante, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1838. Okay. Moleque, ginga, batuque. That means boy, swing, and drumming. Those are Kimbundu words. Those are Kimbundu words. Okay. That we speak this day in Brazil, spoken widely in Brazilian Portuguese, from Oiapoque to Chuí. That means from north to south. All right. But even though we're very familiar with these words, we know that they are African, and especially from Central Africa. When Brazilians try to trace or look at the origins of a substantial part of the population, okay, they sometimes have difficulty in understanding where they're coming from. Even though they know that a lot of the words, Central African words we speak in our Portuguese, comes from Central Africa, particularly from Kimbundu. When they look at works by Africanist scholars in Central Africa, they are sometimes lost about where these people came from. Okay. And that is because most of the historians of Central Africa, they argue that majority of slaves leaving Central Africa to Brazil during the 19th century came from deep interior of Central Africa, from beyond the Congo River, which is this river located here. Okay, from this territory, essentially. Okay. But it's never clear what language did they speak, what gods did they worship, right? And why we can find traces of these people either in Africa or in Brazil. And my explanation for that is that because they were just a minority of all Africans sold into the transatlantic slave trade from Central Africa. The majority actually came from three linguistic groups. The first one, the Kimbundu speaking people who came from this area located in this map, right? The Kikongo speaking people located north of the Kimbundu, and the Umbundu speaking people located to the south, as you see here in this map, right? And in my work, my book manuscript that I'm talking right now, what I do, I use the lists of liberated Africans in addition to slave registers by Portuguese colonizations in Angola itself. And what I use from these two sets of documents are a column, where it's a column list there that says nations or country of origins. And what I look in this column are ethnonyms or names associated to people, to specific people. Because in these columns come a lot of information, sometimes just broad geographic regions like Angola or Congo, right? Sometimes a name of a village, a town, like Malange, right? And sometimes ethnonyms, names associated to people like Kassanji, for example, all right? So I use that information to trace. And by using that information, I found out that majority of slaves were coming from these three linguistic groups that I mentioned, the Kimbundu, the Congo, and the right? But this project, I wanted to try something different. Instead of using ethnonyms, I wanted to use the names of the Africans. All right? Now, for Africans arriving in Brazil, liberated Africans arriving in Brazil, we unfortunately have just one list of Africans containing their actual African name. Just like we have David mentioned it for Sierra Leone, and Henry for Havana, right? Just one list, and that is the list from the slave ship Brilhante. The slave ship Brilhante was a ship built here in the United States. It was called Valeria, right? And was sold to a Portuguese trader who lived in Rio de Janeiro in 1836, okay, who renamed the ship Brilhante and employed at least secure license to sail to Angola. We don't know exactly what happened to the ship afterwards. I know that it probably engaged in one slave ship, one slave voyage before the one I'm going to talk about here. All right, but it's a somewhat obscure story about this ship. But in about May of 1838, it was captured off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. See here on this map. Okay, this area exactly, according to geographic coordinates collected by the British men of war, captured them, the Brilhante, just near Rio de Janeiro. Okay. I don't know if you noticed that I used the British cartographic notation to indicate that the ship was captured with Africans on board, which means a circle across. Just for those liberated Africans aficionados, right? So it was captured then, okay? I know. And when the British captured the ship, they collected all the documents that was available on board the ship, including the logbooks of the Brilhante. Okay? We don't have several logbooks for slave ships, Brazilian slave ships, right? But for the Brilhante, we do have. We have actually a set of logbooks. One belonging or made by the captain, other made by the what we call master, right, or the intermediate, another by crew members, because these logbooks were just printed in Rio de Janeiro, and everybody could buy one and track the course of the voyage if they wanted, right? And by selecting all the information, I was able to reconstruct the voyage of the Brilhante. Right? It departed from a place called Dois Rios, south of Rio de Janeiro, in January of 1838. Right? It took over 25 days to sail across the Atlantic to Angola, which is located here in Central Africa. Okay, each arrow here you see on this map represented one one day of the voyage, right? And is marked by a set of longitude and latitude coordinates. Okay, we see this funny representation of areas here is because the ship was sailing in calm waters or very weak wind. So that's why we have this number of arrows there. On the return voyage in March and April, departed from Umbris, where the ship actually loaded slaves. Okay. Before arriving in Umbris, the captain and some crew members disembarked in Luanda, where they would secure legal papers, right, to sail back to Brazil. And part of the crew took the ship to Umbris, which was an independent port. It was situated outside European jurisdiction, okay, between the Kikongo and Kimbundu lands. There were also no African authorities who claimed ownership of the port, Umbris. It was, in fact, by descriptions of Europeans who traveled to the region at the time, just a very desolate place and used for the quick embarkation of slaves. So after securing legal papers, just to pretend that the voyage was part of a regular commercial enterprise as opposed to a slave trading expedition, the crew, or the captain and the crew, met the ship probably outside the port of Luanda, and then they sailed back to Rio de Janeiro, and they were ultimately captured in May 13, 1838. Okay. Arriving there, captain of the British man of war claimed the Brilhante as a good prize and took it to the court of mixed commission established in Rio de Janeiro at that time for the adjudication while the ship was carried or loaded with Africans, and all the paraphernalia used to trade slaves, so it was just obvious that it was a slave trading expedition, and then it was adjudicated by the court. Okay. It took a long time to condemn the ship, partly because of disruptions during the process with the trial, but eventually, as part of the mixed commission function, they recorded all the Africans on board on a list of liberated Africans. There were multiple lists. I think Daryle was going to talk a little bit more about that. But for the case of the Brilhante, in 1838 there were at least two. One official, it was made just after the adjudication of the ship, or the first attempt of adjudicating the ship, or condemning the ship. And there was what I call an unofficial one, made for internal purposes, apparently, of the mixed commission court. And it is this list, the unofficial one, just made a couple of months, or no, just a month after it was captured, that it contains the names of the Africans in their native language. This is how the list looks like. We talk about the names of liberated Africans. I want to show you here an image of this list. This is how it looks like, more or less. This is the unofficial one, right? On the top reads in Portuguese, list of the Africans on board the brig schooner Brilhante, 23rd of June 1838. Namely, the names of the Africans, their nations, okay, their marks, most of them iron branding, the place where the marks were located, okay, the age of the individual, and just additional observations that they could record, right? And here are the names of the Africans in their native language. Okay. The list was probably made by the mixed commission officers, okay, it's not clear why exactly they made the list, but apparently it could be for several reasons. One is to control the population which was recently arrived, but also at the time there were rumors about Africans being kidnapped and sold into slavery once they arrived, so there was also this important preoccupation. Also because some of the prizes, the Brilhante and the other ships that were captured were kept together for a long period of time. They also were afraid that Africans from one ship would be transferred to another. So probably it was just to control the population rescue from the slave ships, just keep a record of that. Okay? But this is the only list with African names available for the liberated Africans who arrived in Brazil. Okay. In 2008, I took this list to Angola, right? And I decided to replicate the methodology that Hugo and David used years earlier. Right? Just copy and paste the methodology in different contexts. Right? I pronounced the names to a Kimbundu speaker who lived there in Rwanda, right? And then you would identify the names. Right? And I think it worked pretty well. Almost half of all Africans listed, and the total number listed is 245, about 102 actually had Kimbundu names, or identified as Kimbundu names. Now, Kimbundu names, first of all, they can be used for people from both sexes. Okay, so it doesn't vary according to gender. Okay, most of them, they come, not most of them, but they could mean something, but it could also be used, or Africans who spoke Kimbundu also had proper names, like David or John, like they have here, okay? And some of these names might also occur in other languages, right? Particularly Kikongo and Kimbundu, or neighboring linguistic groups that belong to the same linguistic family, the Bantu linguistic family. So some specificities about the Kimbundu names. Okay, and what I was more interested in this case was, well, now that I've identified the Kimbundu names, and it's clearly that a majority, right, or a great number of all these Africans had Kimbundu names, I would like to compare who had Kimbundu names to the nations to which they were related there in the documents. Okay. And I came up with this very interesting result of table. You can see here. Okay. All right. So this table shows the nations of origins as listed in the document. Okay. And here I have the number of Africans with Kimbundu names, the total number of Africans. You have here the ratio, right, of this number over these. Okay. Well, many of the nations, as you know, even today, can be organized into linguistic groups because we know, for example, that Kasanje were Kimbundu speakers, right? Miombe belong to a different non-Kimbundu language, to the Kiyombe language. Monjolo to the Teke language. Okay, Mosorongo and Moange are related to Kikongo language. Okay, so there were essentially three groups: the Kimbundu, non-Kimbundu, and nations that we cannot actually identify to which language they belong. Okay, and what is interesting is that in this table here, it shows that almost everybody belonging to all the nations had names, had Kimbundu names. Right? That's one thing that we notice here right away, and we don't know exactly what that means. It could be that I mispronounced and my interpreter there may have misinterpreted as a consequence. It could be names that belong to more than one language group. But also could be, for example, in cases of Africans who were captured and spent a significant period of time in Kimbundu land or a non-Kimbundu land, and they adopted names or the nations of their host, right? So I think one interesting thing that this table shows is that, well, maybe there were more complex patterns of migrations in the interior of Africa before these Africans were sold into the transatlantic slave trade. This is something that we have to observe, right, or further investigate. Okay. Well, another interesting thing here is that, for example, for broad designations or nations of origin, such as Angola or Congo, we have pretty much almost the same ratio. That is to say, about 40% of each of these nations were made up by Africans who had Kimbundu names. Okay, so that helps us to narrow down their origins or place of origin in the interior of Angola to the Kimbundu linguistic group. Okay. All right. And it is a relief, for example, that about 70% of all the Kasanji, who is a traditional Kimbundu speakers, are identified as with Kimbundu names. So, very interesting results. That many of them still require a lot of for additional investigation. But to my point, at least, both the ethnonyms and the names, the personal names, indicated the Africans were coming from places closer to the coast, from the Kimbundu, Kikongo, and probably Umbundu, as opposed to the very distant interior of Africa. Both informations supporting each other. That's my main point. Now, another very interesting thing that the names allow us to do is to understand a little bit more about the societies affected by the slave trade, okay? And including their place of origins. And I'm going to read here from my paper because I don't want to get lost. Okay. So the Kimbundu names of the Africans transported in the Brilhante do not follow a specific pattern. That's what we're interested to do, right? To identify patterns. But they provide us with some additional clues to the Africans' origins and how they were captured in the interior of Angola. The names also help us understand more about the societies affected by the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. So a quarter of the Kimbundu names identified refers to personal names with no specific meanings attached to them, just like David or John. The remaining names can be classified in various ways with some overlap between categories. So for example, Ganga, which can be translated as sorcerer, medicine man, priest, or religious person, could well apply to religion, social status, occupation, and even enslavement, since some Africans were sold into the trade for practicing witchcraft. However, Africans with names indicating places and methods of enslaving make up almost 30% of the total identified. And they provide us an interesting picture of the Africans' origins and the methods used to entrap them in the interior of Angola. So, Kimbundu names, denoting the origins of the Brilhantes Africans, usually refer to kingdoms, ethnicities, and places. And I made a map here to help us guide ourselves. Kasongo and Matamba, for example, are names derived from the kingdoms of Songo and Matamba, or the people that we see here in capital letters, right? Matamba in this case, right? And Songo, respectively. Both were located in the Kimbundu land east of the Kwanza River, which is this river right here. Okay. They emerged in the 17th century and remained independent throughout much of the 19th century. 3 individuals had names related to ethnic groups: Jinga, associated with the people from Matamba; Lenge, with the Malenge of present-day Malange; and Angola, a name derived originally from the title given to the kings of Dongo, a 16th century kingdom located in the interior of Rwanda. Finally, 6 Africans were named after villages and towns. These included the Bengue, as we see here, at these points in the interior, Goma, and Jundo, located in the northern Kimbundu land, near the borders of the Kikongo-speaking region, and Gunsa, Loamba, and Luamba, located at the heart of the Kimbundu land along the Kwanza River Valley. Names describing forms of enslavement usually refer to warfare, judicial proceedings, and self-enslavement. 5 individuals had names that were clearly associated with violent conflicts. Gwanji, from Pikwanji, brave soldier. Those are names of the Africans liberated from the Brilhante. Guma, meaning enemy. Kibulo, first battle. Ita, war. And Gambu, war victim. 3 had names that may have been derived from judicial proceedings. Panda, meaning adultery. Nitukina, condition. Mbula, banishment or leaving. And Mamona, Mamona meaning the problem is yours. Finally, yeah. Now deal with it, right? Finally, 6 individuals had names referring to self-selection for enslavement. 3 were named Kiangala, meaning drought, and people who were escaping drought or decided to volunteer themselves to slave in order to survive drought and famines, right? 2, Kadea, or those who do not eat, people running away from famine, starvation. And 1, Gasono, that is, I chose. West Central Africans often acquired several names during the course of their lives. These names were usually related to important events that they experienced. Although the rationale for these names or when they were adopted is not clear from the records, the reference or the experience of enslavement, sale, and transportation across the Atlantic was sufficiently traumatic to allow some individuals to change their names to something that would express their experience. In this case, the transatlantic voyage or enslavement. The remaining names are not directly related to the slave trade, okay? But they provide us an important feature of the societies affected by the traffic. These were rural societies divided by social class, no tribes, as most of us tend to think. They valued the fauna and flora of their environments, created tools and implements essential for their way of life, and believed in God, spirits, and the afterlife. Names like Moade, Lord, and Bomba, chief, indicate that Kimbundu societies affected by the slave trade were divided between aristocrats or commoners. They grew tubers like cassava and yams, but also cultivated grains such as millets and peanuts. Bomba, for example, is a stage in the production of cassava flour. Bomba was one of the names of the Africans liberated here. Kanji comes from Ndanji, a place to dry seeds. And Kianga is a name derived from an object used to roast peanuts. Very popular in Angola. You see everywhere, people roasting peanuts and eating with bananas. Kimbundu speakers depended on hunting, gathering, and fishing to supplement their diet. As a consequence, many of their names are related to their fauna and flora. Lombo, for example, refers to a group of wild pigs. Nyoka means snake. Kipungo, wolf. Bimba, bird. Makombe, wild dog. And Kibele, a fish, similar to kakusu, also very popular in the Angola cuisine today. I've tried. Good, it's good. Mukinji is a tool hunters used to attract animals, while moombo are leaves used to feed rabbits. All are names extracted from the list of liberated Africans from the Brilhante. As a traditional rural society, the Kimbundu-speaking people had a profound belief in God, the power of the spirits, and the ability of humans to interact with the spiritual world with the help of mediums and musical instruments. Therefore, many individuals had names associated with their religion. Zambi, for example, was a popular name related to God, the Creator. The seed represented death and the pathway to the afterlife in several West Central African cultures. So many Kimbundu speakers on the Brilhante were called Kalunga. Speakers or spirits, including those of the ancestors, appeared white for Central Africans, which worshippers copied by covering their bodies with white dust called pemba, a common name in 19th century Angola, as well as the Brilhante. Ganga was a name related to mediums or sorcerers, but worshippers could also contact spirits with the help of drums called goma, specific drums, a name many individuals adopted. Finally, 19th century Kimbundu speakers, like many other African societies of the time, viewed the birth of twins with great spiritual concern. And if you read, for example, Chinua Achebe's Twin Fall Apart, you will understand why. As a consequence, they used a specific name to call individuals who were born after twins, Vunge, one of which appears listed among the Brilhante's liberated Africans. So, in conclusion, the names of the individuals listed of liberated Africans allow us not only to explore their origins in the interior of Africa, but also to understand more about the culture and the societies that were transported to Brazil and other places of America as well. And by looking at this information, comparing with other records, including the ethnonyms available in the list or in the column called nations, right, we can pretty much see why Kimbundu is such a prevalent language spoken in the Brazilian Portuguese today. Thank you very much. All right. Podium concluded.
Hello, everyone. I want to first start with PowerPoints. I want to thank Alex, first of all. We met at the poolside at the Marriott. Yes, the poolside at the Marriott in September of last year, and here we are 1 year later. So I'm very happy about this. So I am, as Alex said, I'm working on a book project which looks at the free Africans of Brazil, and particularly a strong focus on those free Africans in Rio, which is the recipient of the largest number of free Africans or liberated Africans in Brazilian slave society. But there are others in other places in Brazil, but particularly those in Rio and their relationship to questions and the experiences of freedom in a slave society. And the larger argument is not just these experiences, but I'm also arguing that free Africans play a very central role in conditioning not just their own particular experiences of freedom in a slave society. As the formerly enslaved, liberated in a slave society, and conditioning not the meanings and the experiences of that freedom, but they also condition the broader arc of slave emancipation, freedom in Brazilian society as a whole. So I place them then in a very central role at the slavery's the particular sort of transformations which take place in the middle of the 19th century in Brazilian slavery, and then its gradual decline, and the constructions of the post-emancipation meanings of freedom and experience of freedom. That's kind of my big argument. Today, though, I'm principally going to be talking more about a project. This is a project which is both a project in and of itself, but also a path for some of my arguments, which deals with technologies of visualization, particularly with GIS, to look at space and time. Again, looking principally at Rio, and I will talk about here a more specific case of one, particularly the experiences from one slave ship. that is that arrived in Brazil in 1838. So that being said, let's make sure I get the notes here properly. I'm going to start out here just for a second here, just so you have a very familiar map here. So basically, the kind of larger product looks at patterns of movement and residence for the Africans of a particular slave ship, but more broadly for free Africans as they moved through Brazilian slave society from 1838 to final emancipation for all liberated Africans in Brazil in 1864, and interrogating the particularities of space and movement in the experience of being free, more specifically free Africans in an American slave society. And this is then framed around various questions about international and local laws and the faithful terms of the suppression of the slave trade and the ongoing dialogues around the nature and experiences of liberty in the largest and most enduring slave societies of the Americas. The chief goal for this particular visualization project that I've been working at Stanford uses nominal list. Some of the nominal lists are the exact same nominal list that Daryle and I have been working on, and other kinds of lists that include a whole range of information, including an incredibly rich information about place. Some of them related to nation, okay, ethnonames, ethnoplaces, but also other kinds of things that we would associate with a very common sense about places. Street names, street addresses, almanacs, property records, and various period street maps, particularly the central parishes of Rio, the capital of Brazil. And cross-referencing these various data is then to develop a series of dynamic visualizations, which I'll show the tool today, I hope it works, that helps to reveal various spatial patterns of movement and residence and work and social networks for emancipados. And then as that's also intersected with other kinds of information, with the voices of the Africans and voices about the Africans to try to understand freedom itself. So that being said, let's start out here with a very conventional map of the Brazilian branch of the transatlantic slave trade here. A very large branch, as you can imagine, as we all know here, but particularly stressing the free Africans. The production of the free African status in Brazil relates to a series of international and then Brazilian laws that date back to the 18 teens that are then finally tightened very strictly in 1850 that prohibit and ultimately actually stop the transatlantic slave trade to Brazil. However, this is a gradual process. It doesn't take place all at once, and there's an incredible amount of work invested by Brazilians and by Africans and by Portuguese, among others, to circumvent the laws. And that produces in excess of 750,000 Africans who arrive in Brazil after the various stages of the suppression of the trade. So there's a very large number of Africans who arrive enslaved against international and national law. Of that case, a very small number, but nonetheless a measurable number of these Africans are on ships, which are apprehended by British and Brazilian cruisers, mainly British, but some Brazilian as well, and producing this under the various kinds of international and national laws, the status of free Africans or Africans of beliefs. Various estimates here, but the numbers here, high numbers around 14,000, low numbers of the period, closer to 8,000 here. Just want to stress, though, these numbers here obviously are very small in comparison to the larger number of Africans who arrive against various kinds of anti-trafficking laws here. So in some ways, this is a very small number of people. We might say, why should we care? Well, one of my arguments is that we should care because they're extremely well documented, as data suggested to us. But also another argument in this kind of larger sense. I think the particular experiences of these Africans and the ways in which both they themselves